Welcome to the Resilient Woman Leadership Podcast, where professionally minded women explore the art of grounding into the powerful foundation that makes us resilient leaders in business and in life. I'm your host, Kathryn Regganie, and I believe that when we women connect deeply with our truest selves, we can collectively shift our leadership culture towards compassion, cohesion, and true creativity. Hello and welcome. I am so excited today to introduce to you Trisha Owsley. She works in private practice in southeastern Ohio and is a licensed therapist with over 10 years of experience. Her clinical areas of focus are the assessment and treatment of psychological trauma, dissociation, substance abuse recovery, and emotional regulation. Trisha has a passion for supporting other clinicians through continuing education and in advocating for mental health care in underserved populations. Trisha is a speaker and an educator on topics of trauma-informed care, clinician resiliency, suicide prevention, and trauma-related clinical treatment modalities. I am so excited to have you here, Trisha.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm really excited to be here and share this topic with everyone.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And just before we jump in, I'd really love to hear just like, how did you get into this specialty?
Oh, good question. I don't know that I can answer that. It kind of found me, actually. It's kind of funny when I was in undergraduate training. I'm like, I don't want to work with the addicted population. I had this list. I don't want to work with kids, but somehow like these things chose me. I still don't work with kids, not because I don't like them, but I have an extensive history with substance abuse counseling. It's how I actually got started in the field. And then just naturally, as you peel back the layers to addiction, you find trauma. And so that's just kind of how the trajectory naturally occurred in my career.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And if you think about it, yeah, we all have trauma of some sort.
We do. We do. And you think of trauma not just as PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, they have these misconceptions about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that only military combat veterans develop PTSD. Totally not true. You or I, anybody, can develop PTSD. And there's a lot of ways a person might develop trauma: car accidents, survivors of domestic violence, um, having a loss by a death by suicide of a friend or family member. It's definitely traumatic. So also being a survivor of child abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, rapes, those are all ways that people can develop trauma. But we do all have traumas. Not everything qualifies diagnostically as PTSD, but we call it in the clinical world little t traumas. So it might be like loss of a pet, it might be a divorce, although some divorces can be really traumatic for people, or like loss of a job. These are what we call little t traumas. They're really disturbing and distressing, but they don't really meet our diagnostic criteria for PTSD. Then we get to PTSD. It has very specific criteria. And then once you get past PTSD, kind of on this trauma continuum, more complex, maybe early childhood trauma, we start getting into the dissociative disorders.
That's really, really interesting. And, we think about trauma as some of those bigger things, the little t, and maybe even it can be like a toxic work environment. So not only at
Sure.
home, we think about at home, an abusive relationship at home, but that can also translate over into the work environment too, although that's not talked about nearly as often as.
Being in a workplace environment where you're experiencing harassment or discrimination, that definitely would constitute a traumatic experience for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Also, something I'll add is cultural traumas
I,
too. The Black community has experienced a cultural trauma. I would also add, as Americans, 9/11 has been a cultural trauma. The COVID pandemic has been a cultural, environmental type of trauma that we've all experienced. So I think we all have this commonality, which kind of binds us together in those ways.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, I think about the pandemic and 9/11, and we all were affected in a lot of different ways. And, some of us were affected very, very firsthand with 9/11 and the pandemic. We knew people who didn't survive those things. And then some people were affected just nationally. They didn't necessarily know any particular person who suffered through that, but just as a nation or as a world, we all were grieving. So, as
Absolutely.
we're talking about some of these traumas and the different levels of traumas, I know we're talking a lot about resiliency today. So, can you talk to me a little bit about developing resiliency? Maybe some of those factors, resiliency
I
factors.
would love to. I could talk forever on this topic, but I will try to keep it in a timely fashion. I'll try to compact everything. So there was an author, I think in the 90s, that wrote this great titled book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And like, yeah, that really kind of got me thinking. So I read this book. It's a dry clinical read, so I don't recommend it, but the title is like just so great. Like, why don't zebras get ulcers when humans do? Well, animals have this great mechanism that I wish humans had, but they have to actually see a threat to develop a stress response. Humans, we have this great thing called our prefrontal cortex. I can't get that out. It's this part in our forehead, that part of our brain, our executive functioning. The thing that makes us different is we only have to imagine a lion to get the same physiological stress response, where the zebra has to actually see the lion. We just have to imagine one, and our stress response gets activated. So we might have fight, flight, freeze kick in. Now, the great thing about resiliency is a concept called neuroplasticity. Our brain is very malleable. Our structures of our brain, our brain cells, our neurons, they can reform connections, more adaptive connections. And that's what resiliency does. It's a way that our brain is rewiring, it's a way that our brains can heal themselves, and make it so we can bounce back from adversity much faster and much more robustly. So we think of, I read these great terms in the last couple of years on social media. Like we always talk about red flags in relationships. There's been a movement with some therapists to start talking about green flags in relationships. And I would say that's a great way of looking at resiliency. We have this negative kind of biased view of the world when we forget that there's positives that's existing at the same time. Our brain really doesn't do well with the duality of our experience. For example, you know, my shirt is green, but at the same time, my plant behind me is green. Those exist at the same time. Whereas in our brain, we're like, well, this is a negative experience. We're not able to see that there's also positive things happening around us at the same time. Our brain just naturally goes toward the negative. We have this negative bias. So resiliency is about those green flags. It's about seeing what's going well. And it looks a lot of different ways for different people. Resiliency is strengthened by this concept of self-care. I kind of, there's another movement amongst therapists. Some people don't like the term self-care. I probably fall in one of those camps. Let me explain why. So self-care is a great concept, but it gets weaponized. as in we're not doing enough to take care of ourselves. We should be doing better. When in reality, we're already doing enough. Like maybe we need to set some boundaries. Or maybe we're too much is being expected of us. Um, so self-care gets a little bit weaponized. That's what I have the problem with.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this idea that we need to be doing more to take better care of ourselves. It shouldn't be weaponized in that way. Self-care just simply means ways that we're able to recharge our battery and still be able to show up and do the work the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So another way I would recommend people develop resiliency, I love the idea of gratitude journals. It forces us to be more open-minded to seeing the positive that we see in everyday life.
Yeah, I love that too. I've used those, and not necessarily a gratitude journal, but when I find myself kind of in that pissy mood,
Yeah.
like, oh, I have to go water the flowers because it hasn't rained in so long. Well,
Mhm.
gee, change your mind and say, oh, I get to go outside and water the flowers and spend some time with the flowers and look at the flowers and smell the roses literally and just really enjoy the what I have right here in my backyard because not everybody has that.
Right. And maybe you don't have to talk yourself into liking the task. Maybe
Right.
it's realizing I really don't want to water the flowers right now, but I get to do this other enjoyable activity next.
Yeah.
Or just recognizing like we might be in that kind of pissy mood sometimes, but recognizing it wasn't a bad day, it was a bad moment.
Yeah, I like
You
that.
know, we assign these labels to like we overgeneralize and we catastrophize. I had a few bad moments today, but these great things also happened. So it's again that negative bias. It's being intentional about how we're choosing to see things.
Yeah. Yeah, I really, really I like that perspective because I know I catch myself in that. And then I just find some good things, whether it's, yeah, I'm watering the flowers and I'm so grateful that I can.
Yeah.
I can water the flowers. I am capable. I am able to walk. I am able to hold the hose. I am able to do these things, and not everybody can. Now, I've
Sure.
been in a situation where my back has gone out and I couldn't. So I have a
Right.
different sort of appreciation for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you're able to be reminded of your capability and your strength. And I think those things are great and empowering you towards
Hmm.
these resiliency factors. And so people, they develop resiliency, and these are really protective factors that kind of insulate us from being more predisposed to developing trauma and through adulthood and in life. We always have these risk factors. There's been a lot of research about what risk factors make a person more predisposed to developing PTSD. There was a groundbreaking study in the late 90s by the CDC about adverse childhood experiences. And what they determined adverse childhood experiences were, did a loved one um, die or die by suicide? Was a primary caregiver ever arrested or substance user, go to jail? Was anybody in your house a victim or perpetrator of domestic violence? Those are just a few things. Also, we know poverty is definitely a risk factor. But resiliency factors insulate us from all of these things. So we definitely want to spend some time to build those and realize what they are.
Yeah. Sort of the insulate. I like that. They're insulators.
Yes,
'Cause those
they
bad
really
things
are.
have happened. They're not going away. They've
Right.
happened. And now how do we move
How do you
through?
keep going?
Yeah. How do you keep
Yeah.
going? So I'm really interested. I want to go a little bit deeper. We have some more time. Is that whole self-care model and how that's
Mhm.
weaponized. I'm just really interested in that because I think you're right. A lot of times people say, "Oh, I'm doing some self-care today. I'm going to go get a massage." Or I'm
Mhm.
doing some self-care, pedicure, manicure, all of that kind of thing. And from my perspective, I feel like it's a lot deeper. So I just kind of want to hear what your perspective is on that just a little deeper as far as self-care and what that might really, really look like.
I love this concept. Thanks for giving me space to talk about it. So I actually did some work with a psychologist from Houston. Her name's Dr. Jenny Hughes. If anybody's interested in looking her up on Facebook, she has a really great group for trauma therapists. But she was talking about how self-care can be weaponized. So she is one that also really hates the term self-care. And I will say through my graduate program, our professors really kind of preached and pushed this idea of self-care, take care of yourself as young therapist so you don't burn out, so you can continue doing this work. But they really didn't give us the how-tos. They didn't really tell us what self-care was. It's almost like this elusive concept you can never really get to, in my mind. Um, Self-care is very individualized. It looks different for everyone. So the idea of getting a massage is great. What if you can't afford it? Getting a manicure or pedicure is great, but what if you can't afford it? Sometimes we have to make really tough decisions by, paying the bills and putting food on the table, especially as women. And a lot of women, we feel guilty about investing in ourselves as well. Like that's just kind of one of these gender roles. Um, and some gender roles that we have had as women could classify as little t traumas if you want to get real about it.
Yeah.
And so self care is kind of weaponized. It's become very commercialized as well. And so really it's not about having to buy things. It's about just showing up for yourself and caring about yourself just like you would someone else you care about. That's
Yeah.
really all we're asking you to do. And keep your battery charged so you can continue doing whatever you're doing in the world and making a difference.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I had a conversation recently too. It was more, when I was going through some of my life turbulence,
Yeah.
if you will. And I remember thinking to myself, I just felt like it was more than self-care I needed. It wasn't just self-care, it was soul care. I mean,
Hmm.
I felt so exhausted, tired, beat up at such a deep level. I mean, no massage or pedicure or manicure was going to touch it. But really, when I realized that I really needed to go deep and get some mentors, some help, some other perspective on really how do I make me the best version of me where I can then start really setting those boundaries that I never even knew exist. I mean, I didn't even know I could have them.
Right, right. Yeah.
And it
And
just
so what
sparked,
you're really describing is burnout.
yeah,
It's where you feel like a nap isn't going to do it. Like, you know, there's really nothing physically wrong. It's not like I can go to the doctor and pinpoint or there's a medication to help me with this. It's just a soul tiredness. It's an
yeah,
exhaustion that's really difficult to remedy, to get relief from. That's what burnout is. That's what it feels like. It's totally consuming mind, body, spiritually, even. Like you are just tired all the way around and feel like there's just nothing left to give. And so,
right,
what do we do when we get to those points? How do we build resiliency to help us bounce back from those things? I think it's great to get mentors, to do your own personal counseling, if you will. Talk to your spiritual advisor if that's a thing that you identify with. Um, our goal with resiliency, though, is to be more preemptive before we get to burnout. We want to prevent burnout.
right.
So, yeah, we
I
want to
know
intervene
that
a little
now.
bit before. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I've been burnt out before too. And it's like physically probably one of the worst times I felt in my whole life. Like
Mhm.
as a therapist, like we're not immune from emotions either, but like I felt really depressed, really anxious, completely exhausted. And I wasn't able to do the best job I could do during that period of time. So it's like we realize what we're doing isn't working so well, so we need to learn new skills.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it's okay to do that.
It is. It is. And necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Trisha. I really, really appreciate you coming on the show. If people want to get in touch with you for, whatever reason to learn more about resiliency or some of your other programs that you've got going on, how can they get in touch with you?
Thanks for asking. So my website is connectiveclinicalwellness.com. They can find me on Facebook and Instagram, both at Connective Clinical Wellness. And that would probably be the best ways to get in contact with me.
Excellent. And we'll have all that in the show notes as well. So if you didn't catch it as she was saying it, it'll be in the show notes and you can find her there. Again, thank you so much, Trisha. And I look forward to further conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Kathryn.
Welcome. Thanks for listening to the Resilient Woman Leadership Podcast. Remember to take my Dragon Woman quiz at dragonwomanquiz.com. In just 2 minutes, this fun quiz will reveal your Dragon Woman and connect you to the resources so that you can leverage her power for good. And if you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe now so you can hear more inspiring stories from other resilient wise women who will uplift and inspire you. Your review really matters to me, so please gift me back by reviewing this episode. Want more, Kathryn? You can find me at energy-pathways.com.